In the past 19 months, the lines between professional and personal have blurred for so many people. With more people working from home, many are reporting extended work hours, checking after-hour emails, and workplace burnout. The Ontario government's trying to change that, proposing legislation that would require workplaces with more than 25 employees to develop policies that give workers the right to disconnect.
Ontario's Labour Minister announcing the Working for Workers Act today and says the message, it's simple. When you're off the clock, you are off the clock. And that people are more than work and family time cannot come last. Joining us live now to talk more about this proposed legislation is Daniel Lublin, an employment lawyer and founding partner of Whitten Lublin, and John Trugakos, an associate professor of organizational behavior and HR management at the University of Toronto. Welcome to you both. Daniel, we'll begin with you. So if this legislation passes, employers would have to make some big changes. First of all, how do you even enforce a policy like this?
Good evening. Thanks for having me. I believe that this would have to be enforced through an anti-reprisal provision, which is essentially employers who do not permit individuals to disconnect could be hit with a complaint or claim to the Ministry of Labour, which enforces the the Employment Standards Act, which is going to govern this change. And those employers could be hit with a penalty, essentially for forcing individuals to work off hours and refusing this right to disconnect.
I wonder, John, if it's applicable to all industries. What do you think?
I think that this is something that's going to take some time to figure out exactly who this applies to. And I think with different types of businesses, they're going to have some flexibility and figure out which model is going to work best for them and how this is going to best apply to them.
John, I think with a lot of people working from home in this pandemic, people are taking calls before and after work. They're checking emails. There's a lot of after work activity happening. Is it even fair for employers to expect something like this? Because over time, it does add up.
Yeah, certainly it adds up. We hear all the statistics on employee burnout and the challenges that we're facing as the boundaries have become so much more blurred through the pandemic between work and home. I want to point out, though, that this was an issue even before the pandemic. This is things that we've been researching for quite some time and has been out there and that companies and workers have been dealing with. So it's just been exacerbated and more brought to light as people have been kind of pushed into the home environment to work. And, it's become a larger problem, of course, as we've gone through the pandemic.
Daniel, is there a comparable policy anywhere else that we can look to see how this works?
France is the first country that has enacted a right-to-work legislation. That occurred in 2017 to fanfare, and for the most part, I've been told that it's been very effective and it certainly helped people to disconnect. I've been arguing for years that in Ontario and Canada, employers are essentially skirting overtime laws because they permit and allow individuals to respond to email communication and other communications off hours and on weekends. They don't pay overtime for that. So in my opinion, this is a necessary amendment that should be discussed and put into play.
John, a policy like this, what do you think this would mean for workplace productivity, perhaps morale?
Sure. I mean, obviously, morale should be pretty evident. I think as people get a little more time with their families and to do things outside of work, it will boost people's well-being. And as a result, I think you'll see benefits to productivity. We know that when we look at employee well-being, when employee well-being is suffering, they just can't be as effective in the workplace. So anything that can be done to really help boost employee well-being, reduce stress, reduce burnout that a lot of people are really being tidal waved over with right now, I think is going to, in the short term and the long term, help productivity.
I wonder about the gig economy, though. Daniel, maybe you can speak to that. So many younger generation people entering the workforce have multiple jobs, and they do work around the clock in order to get their work done, right? Industries like newsrooms give you cell phones to take home with you so you can stay up to date as well. How do you wipe all of that away under this policy?
You don't wipe it away, but you develop policies and principles to make it work better and to enhance the system that we have in place. For individuals whose working hours are in the gig economy, are not necessarily your 9-to-5 job, there is still a way to have a right-to-work policy in place that doesn't improperly disadvantage them for the hours of work that they hold.
John, listen, I think we've all been there. It's hard to say no to your boss. And I think a lot of people may have trouble enforcing the rules here. So how do you see this playing out? And do you see it actually making a difference in the workplace?
I think certainly that there will be a number of companies that will adopt this, that, there are a lot of companies I've spoken with are looking for ways to make their employees' lives better, to improve their well-being and their productivity. So I think there will be companies that will adopt it. There will be some gray area and some people who may be somewhat resistant. And so I think part of the issue is once this gets in place and it starts getting enforced, and when you see companies effectively adopt it and see the benefits of it, it'll become something that employees will expect. And I think that it'll be something that when companies do well, employees will say, well, I'm not going to go work for this other company that is not doing this, or that maybe isn't following this, and going to look for people that are going to really implementing this effectively to work for.
Daniel, also the Labor Minister announcing a ban on non-competition clauses today.
Yes, that's correct. This was a very interesting development. Essentially, there would be a complete ban on non-competition clauses. Of course, they didn't tell us to how that would apply, except for an exemption in the case of a sale of business, but that would be very interesting. No new job seeker that I come across ever wants to see a non-compete in their employment agreement, but lo and behold, it happens all the time. 9 out of 10 contracts that I review, even for junior employees, have non-competition clauses, and I often tell those individuals, number one, they're hard to enforce in court, but number two, there are other ways for employers to achieve what they're looking to achieve with a non-compete, but through other clauses. So perhaps it is time to start having a discussion about whether we need non-competes in Ontario employment contracts and what employers can do in place of that.
Daniel, are you surprised to see that it's taken this long to have this kind of conversation and to perhaps look at something like this happening in Ontario?
That's hard to say. I think the right to disconnect law was more immediate or urgent, especially with people working from home. The business about non-compete, some people think it doesn't affect them until they get a new job offer. And now, because the mobility of the workplace is such that people are bouncing around, I mean, we've heard the statement, it's the Great Resignation. Now is probably a good time to start talking about an overhaul of the Employment Standards Act. And this is a very unique, interesting thing to look at, is whether or not we should do away with non-compete clauses.
John, you mentioned that burnout was an issue pre-pandemic. How do you think this new law will be received by employees?
I think employees will, I think a lot of people are really looking for help with this issue. And so I think a lot of people are going to be quite happy and encouraged by a law like this. And I think once it gets fully implemented and employers and employees kind of work out what this looks like in practice, we should see a benefit from this. And we see in other countries where this has been implemented that this, of course, has been enforced, and that there are benefits to this, and reports are that it is helpful to workers. So I think this is something that people are looking forward to, because, it is sometimes hard, I think we talked about earlier, to say no to the boss, to, kind of cut that work off. Even people feeling like they have to keep going. Now there can be a boundary put in place for them, and so that can be very helpful.
And Daniel, it sounds like you think this policy doesn't go far enough. So do you think it is time to revisit, perhaps tighten overtime laws here at home? Overtime laws would be one thing.
There's a number of provisions in the Employment Standards Act that probably are due for an overhaul. And if we're starting to look at doing away with non-competes, then maybe we should look at increasing the severance and termination pay provisions for individuals. Termination pay in Ontario, if an employer doesn't have a payroll over $2.5 million, caps off at 8 weeks after 8 years. That may not be competitive anymore. Something we should consider.
Okay, Daniel and John, thank you so much for this conversation. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.